Again, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Paul Ligeti, and I am the Vice President of the Historical Society of West Windsor, which is a 100% volunteer nonprofit that has preserved and promoted local history since 1983. Our headquarters is the West Windsor History Museum at the Schenck Farmstead at 50 South Road Road. It's a 1700s era property. We have several centuries old buildings to explore, and it's been a museum for a few decades. One thing that's special about today is we have, I guess we have more than the number of people I expected from the Historical Society here. I just want to thank, Regina and Bonnie for helping to set up the displays. But also another member or former member we have here is Mary Schenck, who, as I'm sure many of you know, was a co-founder of the Historical Society about 40 years ago and helped lead the society for several decades. The Schenck family farmhouse is, again, the headquarters of the Historical Society. And Mary, it's great to have you with us. And she and I can help answer any questions that any of you might have at the end about local history. So again, thanks everyone for being here. So last year, just to give a bit more context, we published a full-length West Windsor history book in celebration of the township's 225th birthday. And this is the basis for this lecture. And if anyone's interested, we do have the book for sale. You can see the link right here. Finally, again, unless there's a technical issue, all questions, if you can hold them to the end, that would be helpful. Say it? Okay. What is it, Regina?
From your voice, I have a teacher voice. I taught third grade for 20 some years, so I have a boom teacher voice here. So Mary, in fact, was a co-founder of the West Windsor Historical Society. This is the book Paul talked about. I know Mary has a copy. He brought one over right away. This is a picture of Mary as her co-founder, and I'm going to leave this here for people to look through. It's my book. In fact, I think I might try to get one to donate to your library. Awesome. I'll find out about that. And Mary and Kay and Clifford Reed co-founded the society, and for decades took care of it. It is gorgeous. It is an incredible accomplishment. And I was really honored to get called up to be the school teacher in the schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse there. And Mary would call her up and say, Regina, do you have time? And I said, I sure do. So it's always a pleasure. All right, go ahead, Paul.
Okay. So I guess the way we're going to start the presentation is by starting at the very beginning in terms of our town's original inhabitants. Although the fog of time obscures the exact origins, we do know that they arrived here many thousands of years ago following the end of the last ice age. They presided over a land that encompassed all of New Jersey and much of the surrounding states, which you can see here. It included Western Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and a tiny portion of Maryland. These people were called the Lenni. Oh, sorry, Regina, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, say that part. I was just going to explain who the Native Americans were.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, they were called the Lenni Lenape, which in their Algonquin language means original or common person. And their territory was called the Lenape-Hoking. And they weren't one cohesive society. They were composed of numerous independent and mostly autonomous tribes that kind of shared this common Algonquin language. And the ones in the West Windsor area were called the Assunpinks. It's a name meaning a rocky or watery place. And you may recognize the Assunpink Creek, which runs through southern West Windsor.
So the original people were Lenni Lenape. This is what their homes might have looked like, a longhouse. We just did a presentation at the library a couple of months to show the children of the school district. And they were a peaceful group of hunters and gatherers. One of our residents found a lot of arrowheads and also some tools that we have for display at the museum.
Yes.
Go, Paul.
Okay. One other thing to add to that is that the chiefs had substantial authority, but they did have to follow their tribe's collective will. And there were roles for men and women in the society. Men traditionally hunted, fished, cleared land, and defended the tribe, while women farmed, gathered fruit and nuts, constructed houses and furniture, raised children, made clothing, and cooked meals. Interestingly, the children belonged to their mother's clan, and leadership was also matrilineal. And as Regina mentioned, they were peacekeepers, but they defended themselves if necessary. So the Lenape first came into permanent contact with Europeans when Dutch settlers founded the New Netherlands colony in northern New Jersey and New York in 1624. 14 years later, so in 1638, a group of Swedish settlers founded the New Sweden colony in southern New Jersey and Delaware and Maryland, and both were primarily trade-based.
After the Lenape, some of them did die rapidly from the diseases that the people from Europe brought over, these people, or else they moved further west. New Jersey and West Windsor was taken over by Swedes. They had, and the Dutch, they had some of the biggest trading going on, even though they were smaller countries. So New Jersey and other parts of our area were Dutch and Swedish to begin with.
Yep. Now, the Lenape, interestingly, were more powerful than the Europeans at first because they far outnumbered the Europeans, who at the beginning were only a few hundred people. They knew the territory better and effectively used inter-European competition to their advantage. And relationships with settlers were predominantly nonviolent, although peace wasn't continuous. Here at the bottom of the screen are a list of some of the more major conflicts, most of which took place in northern Lenape territory, usually around New Netherland, kind of the border of New Jersey and New York. So in 1664, remember they were Dutch and Swedish at first, but in 1664, England annexed New Netherlands from the Dutch and renamed the territory New Jersey. So New Jersey traditionally celebrates its birth year as being 1664 when the English annexed it. After this point, thousands of more colonists soon arrived, claiming vast tracts of land. This included William Penn, who you might recognize as the founder of Pennsylvania. But what many people don't know is he was also one of West Windsor's first European landowners. And Penn was famously friendly with the Lenape, although many others weren't. Oh, sorry, Regina, did you?
I'm sorry, it was a little anecdote.
Oh, okay, okay. However, Penn was an exception, and issues persisted between the New World and Old World. Some of this was due to cultural differences, such as discrepancy on how land treaties were viewed. Notably, while the Lenape viewed land treaties with Europeans as agreements to share land, Europeans traditionally interpreted them as agreements to cede land instead. Deception also abounded, and even William Penn's own sons helped defraud the Lenape over 1 million acres of land in eastern Pennsylvania in 1737 in a case known as the Walking Purchase. And as Regina had previously mentioned, the biggest killers of all were colonial diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, which killed thousands of the Lenape. And at the time when Europeans settled here, estimates vary wildly, but it's generally thought that there were somewhere between 8,000 and 20,000 Lenape living in the overall Lenape-Hoking territory. So by the 1700s, the Lenape status in their homeland was tenuous. Many fought back during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. However, most, but not all of them, ultimately decided to leave their ancestral lands. From the early 1700s to the early 1800s, countless tribes sold their land to the colonists and moved northward and westward, some as far as the Midwest and Canada. Research suggests that the Lenape left the West Windsor area by the very early 1700s. Now, the Lenape are not entirely gone, however. Those who moved westward, their descendants actually still have tribes in those areas, and ultimately the federal government recognizes 3 tribes. 3 others are recognized at the state level, including 2 in New Jersey, who are the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape in the south and the Ramapo Lenape Nation in the north. Canada also recognizes 3 tribes in Ontario, and ancient traditions are preserved through powwows, which are pictured here, charities, the resurrection of old dialects, and advocacy for rights and recognition. Vestiges of the Lenape remain in West Windsor. Artifacts such as arrowheads have long been found around waterways and farmland. Additionally, a deed from 1703 shows two Lenape selling hundreds of acres of land south of the Assunpink Creek for 5 coats, 2 hoes, 2 hatchets, 4 knives, and 1 gallon of rum to David Lyle, who was another one of West Windsor's first European landowners. West Windsor is also home to an area known as Totomy Swamp, which is wetlands largely between Clarksville and North Post Roads that were likely once owned by a seminal Lenape figure named Moses Tunda Totomy. Totomy was a prominent peacekeeper who settled numerous intercultural disputes and was a party to some of the state's most important treaties in the mid-1700s. Following the Lenape's departure, the land was inhabited and open for settlement by West Windsor's first colonial settlers. So then we're moving into colonial settlement at this point. So the first colonial land acquisitions in our area began in the 1690s. In 1693, William Penn purchased a 6,500 acre tract between the Assunpink Creek and the Millstone River. This is this territory to the left that you can see called Penn's Neck. 4 years later, so in 1697, a man named David Lyle acquired 4,500 acres directly east of Penn's property. The division line between their two properties was called the Penn-Lyle division line for many, many generations, and it eventually became known as Penn-Lyle Road when a road was constructed there in the 1860s. Other European landowners are also shown here, such as Thomas Warren and a few others. However, all of them lived elsewhere, and it was not until the 1730s that the first large wave of colonial settlers began to arrive in the area. Now, starting in 1731, our area was known as Windsor Township in honor of the Royal English town of the same name, where, Windsor Castle is in England. It encompassed a significantly larger area than modern West Windsor because it also included all of present-day East Windsor, Robbinsville, and Hightstown, all of Princeton southeast of Nassau Street, and portions of Millstone and Monroe Townships. Despite its size, Windsor Township was hardly populated at first, but the area's waterways and fertile soil soon invited the establishment of mills, farms, and communities. West Windsor's first wave of settlers arrived starting in the 1730s. These early families were predominantly Dutch and British, with familiar names such as the Schencks, Covenhovens, Updikes, Voorhees, and Bergens, Tyndalls, Hutchinsons, and more. They turned thousands of acres of forest and meadows into endless expanses of farmland. They built sturdy houses and barns of timber and stone. Starting in the mid-1700s, Presbyterians formed local congregations, and in the late 1700s, Baptists did as well, and there were also Quakers in the area. Our colonial predecessors also built a network of dirt roads, many of which last to this day. The oldest one that we believe was built was Princeton Hightstown Road. Its earliest portions were built by the 1740s. So West Windsor retains a few remnants of this original wave of settlement. For instance, the picture on the right shows the Schenck Covenhoven Cemetery, which is west of Route 1 and north of Washington Road. And that may date back to at least 1746, if not a few years earlier. Several houses in West Windsor, including the Schenck Farmstead, which I mentioned is home to the West Windsor History Museum and the headquarters of the Historical Society, are also from this time period. Even today, our town still features about 200 sites that are at least 100 years old, and about 20 of them may be from the 1700s. Now,
can we stop just to see if there were any questions so far?
Sure.
Was there anything, or we're okay?
That is Mary's house.
That's Mary's house, right? I was just going to see if this worked.
Yeah, it is.
Right, good. So that is Mary's house. It was actually Warren's house, right? Yeah, and you lived there for a certain number of years, right, Mary? 5 years. 5 years.
With my in-laws.
Right, everybody all tucked in the house, and your husband was born in the house, because most people did, pardon me?
And their baby.
And their babies, okay, all right.
Born there? I wasn't born in the house.
Okay,
but
by
you lived
then,
in the
right.
house. Okay.
Right. And it's wonderfully preserved. It's actually like they've done such a wonderful job. And this cemetery is phenomenal. So Princeton was building all the time, the university. And Paul had some meetings with Princeton and Applegate, as a matter of fact, Kristen Applegate, his oldest daughter. And then some local clergy, because this cemetery is kind of an orphan cemetery. It was taken over by Penn's Neck Cemetery. And they are building all around that cemetery. They're maintaining it. They're keeping it exactly the way it is. And the church refurbished the walls, and the university built new.
So where exactly, Washington and Vermont?
So you go, help me with this, Paul. You go down Washington Road on your right-hand side where there, you can see it now. There's an opening in the construction, and it's on your right-hand side, and it's tucked in there.
Towards Princeton is on your right-hand side?
Correct.
Yes.
Heading towards Princeton on your right-hand side. And they actually called it like a centerpiece of that campus, the West Windsor campus in Princeton.
Yes.
And they're doing, they are quite generous about taking care of it.
And we're working with Princeton and the Princeton Baptist Church, and our hope is to put up a permanent cast metal sign there describing the history of the cemetery for people who are, walking by. Okay. Regina, ready to go to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay.
It was Mary's house, I wanted.
Okay.
The centerpiece of the museum.
So the areas, so I talked about, how there was an agricultural dominance in West Windsor, but unfortunately this also incentivized the use of slavery. A census from 1790 reveals that about 190 people were enslaved in Windsor Township, which again was the predecessor to West Windsor. In 1802 tax roll for West Windsor shows about 24 slaves. The institution did dwindle over the years. By 1840, 3 individuals were still enslaved in town, according to the census of that year. And the 1860 census, which was recorded 14 years after New Jersey ostensibly abolished slavery, still actually did record one woman named Diana Updike still being enslaved. It wasn't until 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, that slavery's abolishment was more stringently enforced. And the picture shown here shows, one of the more dramatic advertisements from a slave owner, asking for people to keep an eye out for runaway slaves. And unfortunately, it seems like in this case, it might have been, a father and mother and their son. Now, on more uplifting topics, we can talk about West Windsor and the American Revolution. So in late 1776, the early years of the Revolution did not go too well for George Washington. And by late 1776, George Washington's cause was actually looking pretty bleak. Defeat after defeat had plagued him since the beginning of the war, and morale was low. With many soldiers set to leave at year's ends where their contracts were to expire, the American cause must have seemed doomed to many who were on the Patriot side. However, on December 26, 1776, Washington's troops surprised and attacked Hessian auxiliaries at Trenton and emerged triumphant. This battle, which I'm going to call the First Battle of Trenton, was the first of 3 skirmishes in just over a week that convinced enough soldiers to stay on to save the Americans from the brink of defeat. On December 30th of that year, so 4 days later, a small contingent of American scouts are said to have ambushed British troops at a farm in present-day West Windsor, just northeast of the intersection of Clarksville and Quaker Ridge Roads. And it's a picture here. This is a picture of that very farm in the 1950s when it was owned by the Coleman family. The captured British troops are said to have divulged critical information about British troop movements to George Washington that may have helped him win the Second Battle of Trenton on January 2nd, 1777, and after marching up Quaker Bridge Road, the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd. Now, hold on, let me just go to the next slide. 1 second.
Hold on 1 second, Paul. So
Yes.
Princeton gets all the glory for having the battle and Trenton, Battle of Princeton that turned the tides of the war. But they marched through West Windsor, what was then West Windsor, as well. There is a obelisk commemorating it in a shopping center right now. What is that, Market Fair or?
Well, there's actually 12 obelisks installed in 1914 between Trenton and Princeton that marked Washington and his army's march from Trenton to Princeton. There's 2 directly in or adjacent to West Windsor. One of them is in the median of Quaker Bridge Road, just next to NASA Park Pavilion.
Right.
And then there's another one directly next to the Delaware and Raritan Canal, technically in Princeton Township.
Right, but just over the line. So West
Yes.
Windsor did have an impact during the Revolution.
Yes. We also know of about 20 soldiers who lived within West Windsor's borders who served in the Revolution, and we might uncover more as more research progresses. And we have evidence of the British burning various farms in the area. And we actually have some petitions for reimbursement to the early American government from farmers in the Penn's Neck area who asked for compensation because the British burned their farms. And one thing we discovered very recently was that Richard Stockton, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, used to own about 300 acres in town. This is now where the Mercer Oaks Golf Course exists. For further context, it's south of Village Road West and just east of Quaker Bridge Road. So a lot of it overlaps Mercer County Park.
Right, nearby.
Yep. So now in February 9th, 1797, so although the township directly after the war kind of resumed a quiet existence, there still grew a movement to split the town in two. A large part of this was due to the fact that there were 2 predominant downtowns for Windsor Township. There was the Heightstown area to the east, and then / Allentown, and there was the Princeton area to the northwest. And there was also there might have been a movement to split the township because of road maintenance as well. Maintaining all of these roads for a relatively sparsely populated area that was so big was difficult. So on February 9th, 1797, there was an act of state legislature which split Windsor Township into 2. It split it into East Windsor to the east and West Windsor to the west, which is why our towns are named the way that they are. And West Windsor actually still retained all land in present-day Princeton, southeast of Nassau Street, until there were 2 land annexations in the mid-1800s, one in 1838 and one in 1853, which ultimately moved our border to the Delaware and Raritan Canal, where it remains to this day. Now, at the first town meeting, although the act that formed West Windsor on February 9th mandated that its municipal meeting be held at an inn owned by a man named Jacob Bergen, who was a Revolutionary War veteran. Interestingly, another thing that we learned very recently is that Jacob Bergen also owned a number of other taverns in Princeton and Trenton and Philadelphia. And the one in Trenton that he owned in 1784 was known as the French Arms, which served as the 9th Capitol building of the United States because the Continental Congress met there in late 1784. So he was a relatively well-connected man who was from ultimately the West Windsor area. And because it was probably because of his connections and his central location in town, that the township decided to hold its first meeting on April 8th, 1797 at his inn in a village known as Dutch Neck. This is where the first township officers were elected. And inns were just generally very common meeting places in West Windsor until the early 1900s. And generally they were common meeting places in early America in general. Bergen's Inn, pictured here, actually still stands. It's now a private residence at along South Mill Road. And you can see a scan of the first township meeting minutes here.
So this is exactly the same. And Nancy told me she knows Sue Applegate, and her house is over here. So we built right around all the historical things that were there. People kept it.
Yes. So, and again, just here's an enlarged version of the township meeting minutes. You can see the various positions that were elected there. Some, such as clerk, who was George Bergen, still exist, but there were others such as overseer of the highways, which have, although there is obviously highway maintenance in town, that specific position doesn't exist anymore. And one other position that wasn't technically in the first meeting, but appeared in the minutes within a few months, was a position called overseer of the poor. Because there was a large, just like many other towns in early America, there was a large level of poverty in early West Windsor. Now, it's worth emphasizing again how ubiquitous agriculture was in Old West Windsor. So farming began with the indigenous Lenni Lenape, who grew a variety of native crops such as corn, beans, and squash. European colonists brought new plants, tools, livestock, and cultivation methods. They turned thousands of acres of woodland and meadows into endless vistas of farmland, which stretched as far as the eye could see. And this landscape persisted for generations, only changing in recent decades. After the turn of the 20th century, there was specialization, especially in dairy and poultry farming, as well as tomato and potatoes. And West Windsor was especially known as a potato community. And whereas a typical farmer in the early 1800s would have owned maybe 3 or 4 horses and cows on several hundred acres of land, in the 1900s, it was not uncommon to see herds of livestock, maybe, several hundred turkeys, many cows, etc., roaming the landscape, albeit with smaller tracts of individual farms. By the mid-1900s, West Windsor had also begun to see the growth of migrant workers. Laborers who were usually African American and from southern states typically moved northward and worked during the harvest season, moving from farm to farm and state to state. They set up temporary residence at local farms for several months, and West Windsor is no exception, during which time they became part of the community, including having their children attend their local schools. And people who grew up here in the mid-1900s and earlier, I'm sure remember a lot of the migrant workers and their children as attending schools as well. And there was a African-American artist named Rex Gorley who worked and who lived technically in West Windsor along the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and had a teaching student there who was well known for his depictions of migrant workers in New Jersey. Now we can explore, West Windsor had several different historic villages. Again, unlike Princeton to the west or Hightstown to the east, West Windsor never really coalesced around one dedicated downtown area. Rather, throughout the centuries, it has seen several historic districts arise within or straddling its borders, each with a distinct identity that set it apart from the others. These communities, more than West Windsor overall, were what generations of residents identified as home. Because of course, everyone was from West Windsor, but the prevailing sense of place was with these historic communities rather than the overall town. So I'm just going to explore these in alphabetical order. So first, we have Clarksville, which is a long gone historic community centered around Route 1 and Clarksville and Quaker Bridge roads. It was named after the Clark family who arrived here around the 1690s, who came to the general Princeton area in the 1690s and moved southward in the ensuing decades. We don't have the exact date that the technical Clarksville area was actually settled, though. It flourished as a stagecoach stop starting in the early 1800s. So historically, Clarksville featured, of course, just like everywhere else in West Windsor, it featured farmland, as well as a blacksmith shop, a wheelwright, a store, a schoolhouse, and 2 inns. In the 1900s, there was also a motor lodge, a speakeasy, and a building called the Clarksville Diner. And the Clarksville Diner is particularly interesting, and you can see it pictured here. It's the top image, because it used to be located in Clarksville. Then in the 1980s, it got moved to Iowa. It was purchased by a man named Gordon Tyndall, who was a diner restoration aficionado. And in the 1990s, it was purchased by a French multimedia company called Canal Plus, who shipped it overseas, and it's still located in Paris, a few blocks away from the River Seine. Clarksville was also the site of a 1950s era agricultural research and development facility owned by a conglomerate called American Cyanamid. There was the construction of this campus and the buying up of the surrounding farmland that marked the end of a lot of the Clarksville area, because American Cyanamid knocked down a number of farmhouses and took up a lot of the farmland. And the campus stopped operating around 2 decades ago and is now slated to become a warehouse complex. Next, alphabetically, we have Dutch Neck, which is centered around the intersection of Southmoor Road and Village Roads East and West. And I would argue that it's West Windsor's best preserved historic community. There's a few dozen houses that are there that still date from the early 1900s or earlier, some of them from the mid 1700s. This community began around the mid 1700s, and its first settlers were indeed primarily Dutch, which is why it's called Dutch Neck. The neck, it probably comes from a word meaning a tract of land or an area or stretch of land. It probably has the same derivation as if you were to use a neck of the woods in a sentence. Now, in the 1700s, a Presbyterian community built a civic and spiritual center here called the Neck Meeting House, which the current Dutch Neck Presbyterian Church replaced in 1816. But ultimately, it was the same community. As mentioned before, Jacob Bergen's Tavern is also here, and town government frequently met here until the current municipal center was built in the 1970s. Old Dutch Neck.
This area?
Are they considered a Dutch Neck here at Bear Creek?
It's ambiguous because there's no clear-cut answer. In the 1900s, the answer would be no, not in the 1900s, but back in the 1700s, these definitions were a lot more loose. For example, I've seen newspaper articles that refer to the Schenck farmhouse being in Dutch Neck, but we're dating back to the 1700s at that point. So it really depends on what time period you're talking about as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In Old Dutch Neck also featured a schoolhouse, which actually still exists, a blacksmith. The schoolhouse is now a private residence. There was also a blacksmith, courthouse, chapel, general store, post office, and a lot more. In 1917, the current Dutch Neck School was built, and 4 years later, the West Windsor Volunteer Fire Company formed here. Dutch Neck remains West Windsor's best preserved community, with a few dozen buildings that are at least a century old. Next, alphabetically, we have Edinburgh, which is centered around the intersection of Edinburgh Road, Old Trenton Road, and Windsor Edinburgh Road. It flourished in the 1700s as a stagecoach stop. Actually, before I mention that, I'll mention that this is an area where people frequently find artifacts from the Lenape, and there is a number of there's a level of evidence to indicate that it might have been the site of a Lenape campground, if not a settlement. And it was a common meeting site for colonial settlers as well, because it grew around a stagecoach route that connected Trenton to Cranberry and other municipalities in New Jersey. Edinburgh was originally called Assunpink after the Creek and the Lenape who lived here until the mid-1800s, when its name was changed. Now, Edinburgh, again, there's going to be a common theme here between all the different historic communities. Edinburgh also had a schoolhouse, hotels, general stores, post office, blacksmith, foundry, distillery, cider mill, and a lot more. Most of these buildings are gone, but some still stand at the crossroads of Edinburgh and Old Trenton Roads. You may especially recognize the Village Pantry Deli, which is just down the road on Old Trenton Road, and which is the building on the top right, although that picture is from the 1940s, and the Edinburgh Hotel directly across the street, which is the picture on the bottom in the 1960s, is now an orange brick and stucco building, again directly across the road from the general store. Next, we have Grover's Mill, which is centered around the intersection of Cranberry and Clarksville Roads, directly next to Grover's Mill Pond. This hamlet grew around the 1700s era saw and grist mills, which were powered by the Bear Brook. Our town's only remaining mill building is located here, although it's now apartments. Early families included the Van Nests, Atchleys, and Bergens. And the area's name was actually not originally Grover's Mill, and it evolved depending on who was the owner of the mill at the time, and it became known as Grover's Mill after Joseph Grover bought the mill in 1868. And we're going to explore this in several more slides, but Grover's Mill is especially well known for being the site of a Martian touchdown in the 1938 War of the Worlds radio play by Orson Welles. Next, we have Penn's Neck, which again, another historic community. It's located at the intersection, well, generally centered around the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1. So near to where that cemetery that we were talking about before was. It got its name from William Penn, who again owned 6,500 acres in western West Windsor. And it was purchased from the sons of William Penn in 1737 by the Schenck and Covenhoven families. A wave of settlement soon followed. By 1746, the Schenck and Covenhoven Cemetery was built, and West Windsor's first schoolhouse was reputedly constructed before 1760 in Penn's Neck. Penn's Neck clustered around Washington Road and Route 1 in the early 1800s. Before then, it was a lot more dispersed. When community members built the Red Lion Inn in 1807 and the Princeton Baptist Church in 1812. Penn's Neck, just like the others, featured institutions such as a blacksmith, wheelwright, general stores, inns. There was also a popular community club, the Penn's Neck Community Club, which operated from the 1920s to the 1960s. And the Radio Corporation of America opened a technological research and development campus here in 1942, which many might know as the Sarnoff Center or SRI International. The RCA was responsible for helping to spearhead wartime communication, color TV, and a lot more both consumer and military technologies. And from the early 1900s and beyond, Penn's Neck especially grew along Washington Road. Now we have Port Mercer and Princeton Basin, which are two similar communities, although they're located in different areas. So Port Mercer is located at the intersection of the Delaware and Raritan Canal and Quaker Road. And Princeton Basin is located at the intersection of Alexander Road and the canal. Both grew starting in the 1830s when the Delaware and Raritan Canal and the Camden and Amboy Railroad were constructed. And they grew as shipping and industrial hubs, which catered to canal and rail traffic. Now, both featured toll bridges, railroad stops, hotels, and a variety of other manufacturing facilities, and their golden ages were in the mid-1800s. However, after canal traffic began to die out in the late 1800s, which we're going to explore in a bit, both of them also kind of declined as communities. Princeton Basin today is basically non-existent. There's a few buildings from its origin, but they're somewhat dispersed, except along Basin Street in Princeton. But Port Mercer is still a little bit more identifiable along Quaker Bridge Road, just next to NASA Park Pavilion. Next, we have Princeton Junction, again, another historic community. It was centered around the train station. And a lot of people confuse Princeton Junction with the overall town of West Windsor, but historically they are not the same thing. Princeton Junction was historically a community within West Windsor, which again grew around the train station. It formed in the 1860s after the Camden and Amboy Railroad realigned from next to the Delaware and Raritan Canal to its current alignment, which is the Northeast Corridor. And it sits at the junction or intersection of two 1860s era train lines, number one, the Northeast Corridor, and then number two, the Dinky line into Princeton, hence its name, Princeton Junction. 1800s era Princeton Junction also featured a variety of industries, as is listed here. In 1910, it was the site of the township's first planned development, which was, in the 1910s, which was known as Berrien City. And the general Princeton Junction area has since expanded significantly over the decades. In the 1930s, it started to grow as a commercial district. Now it's a commercial and transportation hub. And again, the Princeton Junction as a postal code is a more recent development that took place in the last few decades. And although, for example, my family lives along Landman Boulevard, so relatively close to Bear Creek, and we're listed as Princeton Junction, historically, we would not have actually been Princeton Junction. Finally, the last community, which is half in West Windsor, half in Plainsboro, is known as Scudder's Mills. It was centered around the intersection of the Millstone River and the Stony Brook. And it grew up around a mid-1700s era mill owned by a man named Jacob Scudder, who was also the namesake of present-day Scudder's Mill Road in Plainsboro. Now, the community, again, featured a variety of industries, and it was also called Aqueduct or Aqueduct Mills after a canal after 1834, when the Delaware and Raritan Canal needed an aqueduct to flow over the Millstone River. In the early 1900s, Scudder's Mill died out as a community when Carnegie Lake was created, which flooded the Millstone River and destroyed a lot of the farmland and the mill industry in the Scudder's Mill area. But some of its houses remain along either Maple Road or Mapleton Road in Plainsboro, as well as Lower Harrison Street in West Windsor. So so all of these were the different historic communities. I think there were about 9 of them that I described. And throughout the late 20th century, the farmland that once separated each of these each of these villages began to be filled in by suburban development. And new residents who came to town, because they didn't see these distinct communities, started to see West Windsor more kind of as an overall township rather than these identifiable distinct villages. Still, many of these historic communities are identifiable to this day, and each deserves, honestly, a lecture in its own right, but that would take too long. So Regina, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Are there any questions about the community?
So how many are there in total?
8 or 9. 9, Paul, did you include that Van Nuysville or just?
So I did not include Van Nuysville for this. Van Nuysville would actually have been the 10th one. There was this little community at the intersection of Hendrickson Drive and North Mill Road and South Mill Road and Princeton Heightstown Road. But that was more of a kind of pseudo community because of how small it was. But I did go through 9 of them. And it also depended on what time period you lived in. People who grew up in West Windsor in the in the 20th century would have recognized 7 villages, or maybe even 6, depending on when they grew up, because Scudder's Mills and Princeton Basin, they had by that point died out as communities by the very early 1900s.
So all the little communities are similar to communities all over the country, where a small group of people settled together with a blacksmith and a post office and perhaps that one-room schoolhouse, which I tend to know a little bit about and put that plug in. So that's how all the communities came to be known. Now, as a whole, West Windsor acknowledged all of those. And besides taking care of that cemetery, one of Paul's other goals with Mary and with Kay and Clifford Reed was to get signs, large, are they iron signs?
Cast aluminum.
Cast aluminum signs that you might see on roads when you drive around that say, this is the historic hamlet of Dutch Neck. This is the historic hamlet of Penn's Neck. And Princeton University actually made a sizable donation. Again, it was somebody we know. And Paul designed them, and they just came in. So they're going to be 4 out of the 9 that we would like are going to be installed this summer. So history keeps on being remembered. So that's a good thing. Just giving you a little plug there, Paul.
Thank you. So on that note, we can explore a few more transportation systems. And again, I previously mentioned the canal and the railroad a few times, but we can go into it a little bit more in depth. So in the 1800s, there was a significant expansion of transportation systems, and public desire especially grew to create an inland water route linking major industrial and commercial hubs such as Trenton and New Brunswick. Ultimately, a scheme for a canal connecting the Delaware and Raritan rivers won out. On February 4th, 1830, the very same day the Delaware and Raritan Canal was authorized, so too was another transportation system, which you can see here, which was the Camden and Amboy Railroad. The 2 initiatives, canal and rail, were soon combined into one conglomerate. Now, the Delaware and Raritan Canal specifically opened in 1834. Barges carried agricultural products and industrial materials such as coal and lumber, and they were pulled by mules that walked along towpaths lining either side of the banks of the canal. In 1839, so 5 years after the canal opened, the Camden and Amboy Railroad ran tracks along the eastern bank of the canal, so technically in West Windsor. For the next 24 years, both transportation systems existed harmoniously, fueling the rise of various communities across New Jersey, again, including Port Mercer and Princeton Basin in West Windsor. Although canal and rail operated symbiotically for those first 24 years, for several decades, there was change on the horizon. In 1863, the Camden and Amboy Railroad was relocated eastward to, again, the current northeast corridor alignment. What this did essentially is it birthed the Princeton Junction train community, as we previously explored, in the train station. However, it also led to the decline of the canal because newer, faster, and more powerful trains stole much of the commercial traffic from slower and smaller barges. The canal saw a steady rate of decline. I believe its last year of profit was 1892, but it didn't actually fully close until 1932. And it was left to languish for a number of decades until the 1970s, when the state actually took it over in the 30s, but in the 1970s there was a large push to rehabilitate it, and it's now a popular state park, the Delaware and Raritan Canal State Park. It's a recreational corridor where people can canoe and kayak in the in the canal itself, and the running and the biking is done on the old towpaths that the mules used to pull the boats from. Now switching topics to education, we can start exploring the start of West Windsor's public education system. So the township's first schoolhouses were usually one room, made of wood, and built by members of the community. In the early days, instruction was privately funded. It was called a pay school system, where members of the community would pay teachers directly to instruct their students. However, in 1828, West Windsor formally organized a public school system. At the time, it included 4 districts, which off the top of my head, I believe were Clarksville, Edinburgh, Dutch Neck, and Penn's Neck. And students in grades 1 to 8 learned in these old wooden schoolhouses still. The number of students in each class varied. Some may have had as few as 1 student, others a dozen or more. Farm boys are said, I don't know how true this is, but farm boys are said to have often attended school only during certain seasons. As a result, some reputedly graduated 8th grade when they were as old as 25 or 26. Now, students often sat, and again, just going a little bit into the dynamics of learning in the 1700s and 1800s. Students often sat on benches instead of desks and seats, and wrote upon slab slates. The schools were heated by a stove, which the students and teachers were responsible for maintaining. Discipline could be harsh, and in the 19th century, children either walked or rode horses to school. And of course, there was religious influence, with texts containing Christian teachings, and schoolhouses themselves often doubling as religious gathering places. The West Windsor School District kept much of this model, but transformation was on the horizon come the turn of the 20th century, as we'll explore in a few slides. Now we're entering.
1 second, Paul, sorry.
Sure.
So at the museum, in addition to the Schenck house and the barn and the carriage house, is a 1-room schoolhouse that the Historical Society had moved from Clarksville Road, and they refurbished it. It kind of sat for a number of years, wasn't touched, and then the township appropriated more money. And right now, it is a classic example of what a 1-room schoolhouse would have looked like. It's just gorgeous. That's where I hang out, in the schoolhouse on the school lawn. And I would tell my 3rd graders that it was very strict. They were allowed to hit you with rollers. You would stand in the corner and maybe wear a dunce hat, although I'm not quite sure about that one, but certainly different than how we teach today. And their tablets were chalkboard, and now our tablets are Chromebooks that the kids do everything online with. So thank you, Paul.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So now we can explore the beginning of the 1900s. Around the turn of the 20th century, various utility companies began to lay telephone and gas lines around town. Simultaneously, many old dirt farm lanes were paved for the first time, and overpasses constructed over the Northeast Corridor rail line. In 1912, the government constructed a dedicated town hall, which is pictured here, which was in Dutch Neck, again, at the intersection of South Mill and Village Roads East and West. At the time, most of the 1700s era structure of the municipal government still prevailed. However, slowly but surely, the government began to expand as positions like a legal counselor, treasurer, physicians, engineers, auditors, and building inspectors appeared. The zoning board notably formed in 1944. Now, again, I'd mentioned that prior to the early 1900s, and Regina also just mentioned it too, children were traditionally taught in small 1 or 2 room wooden schoolhouses. However, the 1890s and early 1900s marked a nationwide progressive movement, what was called the progressive movement, and part of this saw a transformation in education where there was a lot more focus on funding schools. And during this time, the Dutch Neck School and its identical twin, which is the long gone Penn's Neck Schoolhouse, were constructed. The Penn's Neck School was located at the intersection of Alexander Road and Route 1. It was constructed in 1917, just like Dutch Neck. It looked identical to Dutch Neck School for many years, although Dutch Neck School was significantly more expanded over the years. And Penn's Neck was demolished in 1995, but the Dutch Neck School still exists and is West Windsor's oldest still operating educational institution. And these two,
Oh,
yep.
sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I'm done with the slide.
Okay, if you can see the very front, those were the earliest school buses. They were carriages with horses carrying them. So my kids always got a kick out of that. And this was my classroom. We went from a 1-room schoolhouse to a 4-room schoolhouse. So I taught in this classroom, which I know my 83-year-old brother-in-law went to 7th and 8th grade in that room, Charlie Applegate. And then the building grew and grew, and then we separated all the grades. So my ceiling in the classroom was hammered tin, the real old-fashioned hammered tin. It was just beautiful. And when they changed things, like added a new heat or new air conditioning, everything went wrong. The older stuff was better. Just 2 cents. Thanks, Paul.
Of course, thank you. The first half of the 1900s also marked the rise of community groups in West Windsor. As I'd mentioned earlier, the West Windsor Volunteer Fire Company formed in 1921, and 5 years later, the Princeton Junction Fire Company formed. Other community groups included a Penn's Neck Community Club, a YMCA, there was a Patriotic Order Sons of the American Revolution, and a number of other groups. Perhaps during one of their gatherings in 1938, residents discussed one of our town's most enduring legacies, which was a so-called Martian invasion of West Windsor. So a lot of you may know very well about this. On the evening of October 30th, 1938.
Do you know about? If you didn't grow up in the area, you might not know about it. Yeah.
Orson Welles, what's the war on?
The War on the Worlds. Right. On
He based it on West Windsor, on the town of West Windsor.
right, the aliens supposedly landed. So
Yeah.
take it away, Paul.
Okay, so on the evening of October 30th, 1938, so 85 years ago, a young rising star named Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the Air radio company thrust the West Windsor area into the national spotlight. At 8 p.m., radio listeners tuned into a weather report and music, only for the broadcast to be interrupted by several fake, panicked news bulletins reporting unusual explosions on the surface of Mars. The ensuing broadcast, which was just a radio play, but was a convincing one, is said to have. Sorry for a second. Oh yeah, the ensuing broadcast, what it portrayed essentially was an alien invasion of Earth, with the West Windsor community of Grover's Mill being the initial touchdown site of the Martians. And just as in the book, which was published in the late 1890s, written by H.G. Wells, the only reason that the aliens are defeated in the play is because they can't handle the germs within Earth's atmosphere. So according to tradition, there was a national hysteria with people fleeing their own lives, forming alien hunting militias, and more. There are some more interesting local tales, such as that of a man backing out through his own garage door, and when his wife protests against this, he tells her, "Oh, it doesn't matter. We're not going to need it anymore." There's a tale of a drunken farmer who peppered a local water tower with bullet holes. And though a lot of this panic was embellished and a lot of the panic was, exaggerated, a lot of it by newspapers who were in competition with radio at the time. The broadcast does still remain one of West Windsor's most famous historical incidents, and a pretty good window into the power of misinformation and the power of the media in general.
You know what? Grover's Mill, was there any connection? Did he have?
No, he had no connection. When I used to teach it to the third graders, because it was on mischief night, and supposedly in the radio studio, everything was radio. He put his hand around the map. They were all in New York City, and he put his hand around, and then poof, his finger landed on Grover's Mill. So that's what I always taught the third graders. But the interesting thing was, you can still get a recording. Now, obviously, you get it off the computer, but before you have Halloween, listening to it, like you get written that Orson Welles was such a good orator. My third graders almost started believing it. And we were sitting in a classroom in the daylight and everything else, and 2006, and they were believing it. So it would be a fun thing to get the recording. My father-in-law just passed away 104, and he remembers people packing up their cars and leaving. They had no idea where they were going, but they packed up their belongings and they were going out of town.
Yep.
Mary, what do you?
That one of the roads that was so well full of cars, people leaving. There was also a number of cars, the people who wanted to come in and see what was going on.
Very interesting, Mary. Yes, so the nosy rosies were coming in one part of the road and the people that were panicked. Now, while the thing is going on, it says this is just a pretend telecast, like every 20 minutes, but people didn't listen to that part of the radio broadcast. Right. Oh, you heard it. Okay. Very cool. Right. That's what a lot of people say. Who knows? Maybe somebody blinked it out of there. But right. So it is our claim to fame. Grover Cleveland also visited Grover's Mill, but that's beside the point. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I will add on to why Orson Welles, chose Grover's Mill. I actually don't personally know, but in addition to him, maybe pointing to a map or a globe, West Windsor and Grover's Mill is conveniently located between multiple metropolises, the Philadelphia area, Washington, D.C., and New York. So it would have had a little bit more impact. And also Grover's Mill, it kind of has this, every town kind of name. Grover's Mill could be anywhere in the United States. So it's a lot more, it can have kind of a wider spread than if you named it a very specific area that not many people might be able to relate to. So unlike War of the Worlds, however, very real to West Windsor was the impact of World War I and World War II. A 1930 census lists several dozen locals as having served in World War I, and a plaque in Dutch Neck memorializes 227 residents, 7 of whom died in action in World War II. Interestingly, the entire population of West Windsor in 1940 was about 2,100 people. So more than 10% of the entire population, I think it's somewhere about 13-14%, of any age served in World War II. And that plaque, I took a closer look at it recently. It also includes, I think, about 9 or 10 women who served either as nurses or were in the WAVES program in World War II. For those who did not serve, in the Army itself, the township also organized scrap drives. There was local rationing, and civil defense squads were also formed. There were a few in town. Also around the same time, the Radio Corporation of America, also related to World War II, as I'd mentioned, built a campus in Penn's Neck off of Route 1 and Washington Road. At first, it spearheaded wartime telecommunications. Later, it evolved into providing consumer products, again, such as color TV. It also worked on satellite technology and a lot more. And again, it later became the David Sarnoff Center and is now a different institution called SRI International. Around the same time, I believe in 1943, there was a company called Hayden Chemical Company, which set up a manufacturing facility just south of the Dinky Line, also along Route 1. It
Paul,
specialized in.
we're going to interrupt again. I'm sorry. Mary had something she'd like to add.
Oh, sure.
I wanted to note that I worked at Hayden Chemical Company.
Mary
really?
worked at Hayden Chemical Company. We should put that in the book.
It was producing penicillin, and I was one of the members of the assay lab. We had to check whether the production matched the government standard.
Okay. Did you hear that? That SA, if that's ASSAY, yeah.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Glad to see that.
Oh, yeah. And a Radio Corporation is RCA with a little dog nipper.
It was bought up by American Cyanogen.
Right. All the big companies. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Also at this time, so now we're getting into West Windsor in the 1950s, so the third quarter of the 1900s. This was a period of substantial change for West Windsor. As I'd mentioned earlier, farmland was the predominant identity of West Windsor. Farming was for generations, starting in the mid-1700s. However, starting in the 1950s, farmland began to slowly be replaced by suburban developments. And this wasn't unique to West Windsor. I'm sure a lot of people know that following World War II, tens of millions of people moved from cities to the countryside and all across the nation and transformed a lot of this agricultural land into suburbs. So West Windsor was no exception. Our town's first post-war residential developments came in the late 1950s, and by the mid-1970s, about a dozen communities had formed. So you might recognize names such as Colonial Park, Princeton Ivy Estates, Jefferson Park, Sherbrooke Estates, Piedmont Drive, and a lot more. Between 1950 and 1980, West Windsor more than tripled in population from about 2,500 residents to 8,500 residents. And here's a picture of an advertisement for Princeton Colonial Park, which is just south of High School South. It's off of Penn Law Road. And, I wish I could buy a house for a little less than $18,000.
$690 for a house, yeah.
Yeah. So another notable among this series of developments was one thing that's particularly notable to me, which was called Glen Acres. It's located just off of Alexander Road and west of Canal Point Boulevard and west of Route 1. This was a deliberately racially integrated neighborhood set up in the 1950s. So for some historical context, the Princeton area, Princeton Township especially, there was a lot of racial housing discrimination where people who were African American could only settle in certain areas of town, but otherwise, real estate agents and home sellers would not want to sell to African Americans. So there was a man named Morris Milgram who worked with a community group called the Princeton Housing Group to create two developments. One of them was Glen Acres, and then it had a larger counterpart called Maple Crest directly in Princeton. Both of these were some of the earliest deliberately racially integrated housing developments in the nation. Not the very earliest, but some of the earliest. And again, Glen Acres was in West Windsor. We actually interviewed a number of the residents just last year. We had a panel with them, and that recording of that conversation is actually on our website now. It's about an hour and a half to 2 hours of them sharing their stories. And a few of the people who moved there in the late 1950s still live there. And according to them, it's retained its sense of community. So that's a particularly interesting development of this era of suburban development in West Windsor. Also, there was a lot of growth along Route 1, which, although when it was built in the early 1800s, just a simple one-lane dirt farm lane. This picture was taken in 1962 by a Princeton photographer named Howard Schrader. And Route 1 in the mid-1900s increasingly developed as a commercial district with apartments, strip malls, and a lot more. People might recognize the Carnegie Center, which was an especially expansive office complex, replacing lots of old farmland, which is a trend that would especially accelerate in the late 20th century. And this picture specifically is along Route 1 looking south, and that is the Dinky Line Bridge over Route 1. So the West Windsor Plainsboro School District also changed dramatically in the third quarter of the 20th century. In 1960, before the 1970s, West Windsor and surrounding towns sent their older students to Princeton High School, everyone who was above 8th grade. However, in the mid 1900s, Princeton, just like West Windsor, was also growing, which forced them to give essentially us and other towns an ultimatum, which was that we needed to remove our students from their district by the early to mid 1970s. With this, West Windsor and Plainsboro decided to split the cost and built a $7 million high school, which is pictured here, which is High School South. At the time, it was known as the West Windsor Plainsboro High School because it was the only high school in the district. Not until High School North was built in 1997. The other developments included the construction of Morris Hawk School in 1964 as well. And in 1969, so 4 years before High School South opened, West Windsor and Plainsboro formally combined their school districts. Around this time, there was also a level of religious diversification, which would especially accelerate in the late 1900s. So as I mentioned previously, the Princeton Baptist Church and the Dutch Neck Presbyterian Church got their start as congregations in the 1700s, but their current houses of worship were built in the 1810s. And they would be the only houses of worship for the next 150 years in the entire town. This changed in 1966. This changed shortly after 1966 when the first Lutheran worship service took place for what is now the Prince of Peace Lutheran Church off of Princeton Heights Town Road. Following this was the creation of a West Windsor Catholic Club in 1972, whose members formed St. David the King Congregation in 1981. In 1975, there was the establishment of a local mission of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the year following, the local residents organized what is now the Windsor Chapel, an evangelical congregation. Also in 1976, Beth Hyam, which was the first non-Christian house of worship, opened its synagogue on Village Road West, so very near to Bear Creek in that year. And this, here's a newspaper article from when Beth Hyam formed in 1971. But again, the religious diversification would especially accelerate in the next few decades. A government also grew during the third quarter of the 1900s. From 1950 to 1975, there was a lot of development. In 1952, the planning board formally organized. The township adopted its first master plan in the 1960s, which was the same decade that the West Windsor Police Department organized. The area's suburban developments necessitated other departments overseeing sewers and water. There was a conservation commission that was also formed and a variety of other arms to the municipal government. Pictured here are members of the West Windsor Police Department around 1968 or 1969, standing in front of the Old Town Hall. There were also, again, more community groups that formed. Local organizations, especially for this time period, deserve special mention. There were political groups, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and more that organized as community involvement grew. In 1972, the now defunct organization called the Twin W First Aid Squad, pictured here, organized, and they operated until 2015. Also in 1952, the West Windsor Lions Club formed, and notably from 1954 to 1968, they circulated a township-wide newsletter, which was a substitute for the newspaper that West Windsor would not have until the 1970s, when the West Windsor Plainsboro Chronicle started to be written. So now, with all this being said, we can move to the the last quarter of the 20th century and beyond. So Regina, does anyone have any questions at this point?
Do I have any questions?
Questions, comments? Mary and I don't like how Route 1 got so developed.
No, you can
Yeah.
draw.
Yes, and Karen as well. You used to be able to drive easily. I mean, I came in 81, so it was still relatively uncrowded. Mary? About Route 1, it was so hard to drive.
It started when I was very young. It was 2 lanes.
Mm-hmm.
It was about 1924.
Mm-hmm.
It increased to 3 they started having accidents.
Okay,
Because
yes,
the passing lane, cars would come in the passing lane and hit each other.
hmm
It was a mess.
it was a mess, right?
And the state police performed about that, and they came to my grandmother's property and rented her rooms for her, the state police, and she took care of them for the next 15 years.
Oh, how about that? How about that?
Mary said her grandparents' farm was Route 1 by like where Lowe's is now.
Right. And if you look on in the local newspaper about police blotter, or you see what the police are doing, they're on Route 1. There was an accident. Someone stopped for drugs. Someone stopped for this.
Yeah.
Right. But it's tough. Like we're in the Northeast corridor, New York, DC, Philly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Two other clubs I would have thought, Paul, the Grange and 4-H. I don't know if that, I know that Kay Reed did both of them, and 4-H used to have its annual celebration in Mercer County Park, which is the big chunk of it is in West Windsor.
Yes, there are those as well.
Agricultural community groups too.
Yes.
That's it.
Okay, great. So now we move into the last quarter of the 1900s. So I just want to show these two maps to emphasize how much change took place, because this was the predominant theme of West Windsor's history in the last quarter of the 1900s, is how much it grew, especially its population. On the left is a map from 1980 showing West Windsor still being about half farmland, which is why it's a lot brighter than the one on the right, which is a lot darker. The darker areas are areas that are developed with houses and suburban developments, and that's a map from 1997. You know, my own family came in this time too, as so did at this point the majority of West Windsor's residents, as we'll explore. So between 1975 and 2000, several dozen residential and community developments popped up around town, like stalks of corn rising out of the farm fields that they were replacing. Between the years 1970 and 2000, West Windsor's population skyrocketed from around 6,400 residents to 22,000. Whereas West Windsor was still 50% farmland in 1980, it was less than a third in 1997. Today, it's about 20% farmland. By the new millennium, our town had fully embraced suburbia. Part of this growth also involved the diversification of West Windsor along racial and religious lines, especially. So in the 1970s, the vast majority of West Windsor residents were white and Christian, as had been the case since the mid-1700s. However, residential growth brought change, especially in the 1980s and beyond. By the year 2000, the proportion of white residents had decreased to about 3/4, and Asian American representation had increased to about 1/4. This change especially accelerated after the new millennium, and Asian Americans at this point make up the plurality, if not the outright majority, of the town's residents. This change in the school district has been especially even more dramatic with, this change in demographics has been especially more dramatic in the school district, with Asian American students now comprising about 3/4 of the student body. Much of this change in demographics in general in and out of the school district came from international immigration, especially from China and India. And a common draw for these new residents was the school district's increasingly esteemed reputation and the township's proximity to interstate transportation. So too, as I had mentioned, did religion change in the last quarter of the 20th century. I'd previously mentioned that before the 1980s, West Windsor only had either had a Christian houses of worship or one Jewish one, which is Beth Chaim on the top left. However, beyond that point, there was a dramatic transformation with the establishment of various institutions such as Chinese and Korean churches, the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton, which is in the bottom center, and much more. So these are 6 of 12 houses of worship that currently exist in West Windsor. The next slide shows the other 6. So today, West Windsor is home to several dozen, again, about a dozen houses of worship, and its leaders, whether from old congregations like the Princeton Baptist Church or Dutch Neck, or newer ones like the Muslim Center Greater Princeton, meeting regularly in a community-wide organization called the Religious Leaders of West Windsor. So there's collaboration among the different institutions. From the 1970s onward, recreation in West Windsor also began to expand as parks were built to complement Van Ness Park, which itself was built as West Windsor's first a formal township park in 1962, or the oldest one that still exists. Mercer County Park was built in the 1970s. And is the most prominent example among many. It's about 2,500 acres. And as the bottom of this slide mentions, again, the Assunpink Creek, which again dates to the times of the Lenni Lenape, was dammed in the 1970s to create Mercer Lake. West Windsor's government also transformed dramatically. It was symbolically and literally shed its historical roots when, in the 1970s, the old town hall in Dutch Neck was demolished and replaced by the current municipal center. A variety of new committees in the government focused on recreation, media, senior services, pedestrian and bicyclist needs, human relations, and much more. There was an increasing need as the township was growing in population, and thus these branches of these elements of the government were created. In 1993, notably, the township rechartered also to what its current format, which is the mayor-council format. Two individuals I like to point out. In the 1970s, Carol Beskay became the first woman mayor. I think it was in 1979 specifically. And in 1993, a man named Sam Dyson became the township's first African-American police officer. Other municipal groups such as town council began to diversify among multiple identity lines such as these. Community groups continued to grow with organizations like the Friend of West Windsor Library, Friends of West Windsor Open Space, and of course the Historical Society of West Windsor forming in the last quarter of the 20th century. Of course, there were many more community groups as well, catering to a new and increasingly diverse populace. By 1997, when West Windsor hosted a year's worth of celebrations for the town's 200th birthday, much of the historic identity it was commemorating was in a state of significant transformation. Now, just to kind of wrap up this lecture, so as you know, an amateur historian in the Historical Society, I spend a lot of my time exploring the past, but I can still guarantee one thing for the future, which is that West Windsor's history will inevitably continue. The past does not separate from the present and the future and is developing with every passing second. Everyone in West Windsor, whether or not it's you or me or someone else, is part of the township's history and is helping to write it, whether or not our families have lived here for 2 days or for 200 years. Our local heritage has benefits beyond just interesting stories. It's fundamentally unifying because it's something that everyone shares. Moreover, understanding the history of our town makes it all the more rich to live here because one can look in any direction and see history and hear the echoes of the generations before us. And realize that the people who lived here weren't just footnotes in some history book, they lived lives as nuanced and important as ours. So protecting this heritage, and here again is the cover of the book, is something that relies on proactivity from everyone who lives in West Windsor. This includes maintaining homes and land, saving manuscripts and artifacts, and documenting the present for the sake of the future, which is a lot of what the Historical Society does. It also involves supporting organizations like the Historical Society. In a rapidly evolving township, this imperative is greater than ever and will help collectively bridge the gap between West Windsor then and now. So with that, that is the lecture. Again, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to take questions. Again, Mary's here, Regina's here. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I can make myself free. I'm here to answer anything.
I'm going to turn you around, Mary, so you can face everybody. Okay?
It's all people you know.
Yeah. And I apologize, guys. We had some technical difficulties with the sound. But hopefully you got some from Regina, some from the slides you're able to read.
And I'm going to leave a copy of this book. This is
Okay.
my copy, but I'll leave it and I'll
Okay,
see if we
perfect.
can donate one for
Perfect.
your library.
So if anybody has any questions about the history of West Windsor, about Mary and her history, anything you want to know?
Pardon me, Mary? So we're seeing if there's any questions.
Is she Catherine Silver?
No, this is Mary. That was Mary's house. This is Mary's.
Wait,
Yes.
one thing you have to remember, the house is named Schenck, but my name was
Right.
not very Schenck originally. It's my husband's name. That's my husband's family. And was born and raised in West Windsor myself, so I know much about West Windsor Township. But I do carry that name with me, of course, and my family has become Schenck by association, and I answer to it, of course. I will know their history. I've done their history. My daughter has done genealogy research of all the way back to the original people who bought this farm land here, some of this farmland. And it's very interesting to know that they came from Netherlands. The name is Schenck, not Schenck. And they came from Netherlands and bought property in Long Island, and then moved to Central Jersey, and then bought some 350, I think it is, acres from William Pen's sons, and established families all along, farms all along US 1. And I could tell you at one time where the houses were of the Schenck family. Some of the original, they were Revolutionary War buildings, still here in the Revolutionary War. Very interesting history area. I enjoy it. We thank Paul for all his information.
Thank you, Paul.
Of course, thank
Could
you.
we meet your daughter? Mary, could we meet your daughter too, who came here? Come on
My
up.
daughter has come to visit and also help me get rid of my house. My house has not been sold yet. And you know, that phrase
Not
that
this one.
everybody's talking about now, all the excess things that you have in the house, you're trying to get rid of.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Very much so.
I made a mental list of little stories as Paul went on. And I should have made a list of paper, but I didn't.
That could be next presentation. And Nancy is Mary's daughter. Well, go through the book, but I didn't realize you were a genealogist and everything else.
Yes,
Nancy.
okay. I've done my mother's.
I've been here years ago. He came to the historical
4 years
society
ago.
asking
A youngin.
to do something in the historical that would get him his Eagle Scout, Boy Scout badge. He was still in high school at the time. And I lost track of it after that until I understand the family lived here in West Windsor. But I understood that later on, he came back and he went to the Historical Society meetings when I was no longer able to go to the meetings. And he has been more active since, doing all the kind of work. He writes a column in the local paper. He has written quite a few little anecdotes, and one of them was the Lenin Love in Indian that we saw. He's done that in everything. We have a lot of collections. And I'm sure this book will be, I hope it's going to be in the library.
It is, I'll make sure.
And anybody who wants to read all about it.
And then check in with Mary for the rest of the story.
Does anybody have any questions for Mary?
That's it.
A big round of applause, Paul, Mary, and Nancy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, yeah. You've got a great memory,
That's
Mary.
what I was going to say, literally.
Yeah.
She lived through it and she remembers it, so
This
that's it.
lady went
I'm
to
sorry
high
to
school.
say, I could not hear anything that Paul said.
It was
I know.
the book, yeah.
Unfortunately, we had some technical.
External speaker next time. And the little external speaker. But a great job, and we'll leave the book, I'll leave it with Karen for the library and get you a new one, too, actually, maybe a hardcover.
Thank you for.
Oh, it was my pleasure, like I said.
You did a wonderful job.
No, really, Paul organized it. We're just movers and we bring the things in. And I so admire all the work you've done over all those decades. The house is gorgeous. The house is gorgeous. The schoolhouse, all in here. And I have many on my phone we could do, and maybe sometime we could bring artifacts too. you know,
No,
little
definitely.
like
That would be great.
stuff.
Some hands-on.
So we'll
yeah.
leave this book here with you.
Okay,
And
yeah.
did you just take a picture of Mary,
Yeah.
your daughter? So
Yeah.
I would like that.
Yeah.
Karen, can you hear me?
Well.
Okay, yeah.
I have my eyes on.
Paul, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, one thing I would like to, again, thank you everyone for having me. Karen specifically, this is just an overview of the history of West Windsor, but I'm happy to give lectures anytime if you want on other topics too, things that
Okay.
may be specific to more specific, as long as it's generally related to West Windsor history.
Okay.
So
Yeah, and maybe we can get you here so we don't have technical difficulties.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
right. Yeah. So that would be great. Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you very
Of
much.
course, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So whatever, he'll do that and sign
Yeah,
off. on
yeah,
it.
I can.
And I'm gonna get that picture. It
So
was
I'll
a-
head out.
to see
Well,
you
have a good
Thank you
day.
so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Bye.
Yes, we still do, and I have, Bonnie is my